It's my greatest moral failure. I think America's greatest moral failure has been throughout our existence. Perhaps we have not devoted ourselves to causes greater than our self-interest, although we've been the best at it of anybody in the world. I think after 9/11, my friends, instead of telling people to go shopping or take a trip, we should have told Americans to join the Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, the military, expand our volunteer, expand what you're doing.
Okay.
Expand the great missions that you are doing, that you're carrying out not only here in America, but throughout the world, especially in Rwanda. And I hope we have a chance to talk a little bit about that later on. And you know, I'm a little pandering here. The first words of your very successful book is, "This is not about you."
Yeah.
And you know what that really also means? Serve a cause greater than your self-interest.
Yeah. Okay, we've talked about this before, about the common good and the common ground and common good. Can you give me an example of a time, you know, I've seen that a lot of good legislation gets killed because of party loyalty. Yeah. Can you give me a good example of where you win against party loyalty and maybe even win against your own best interest for the good of America?
Well, you know, I'll give you an example that, in fact, I worked with John McCain on, and that was the issue of campaign ethics reform and finance reform. That wasn't probably in my interest or his, for that matter, because the truth was that both Democrats and Republicans sort of liked the status quo. And I was new to the Senate, and it didn't necessarily engender a lot of popularity when I started saying, you know, we're going to eliminate meals and gifts from corporate lobbyists. I remember one of my colleagues whose name will be unmentioned, who said, well, where do you expect us to eat, McDonald's? And I thought, well, actually, a lot of your constituents probably do eat at McDonald's, so that wouldn't be such a bad thing. But I think that we were able to get a bill passed that hasn't made Washington perfect, but at least has started moving things forward. You know, I guess the other example where I'm not sure that this was more of a partisan issue, but it was something that I felt very deeply, was when I opposed the initial decision to go into war in Iraq. That was not a popular view at the time, and I was just starting my campaign for the United States Senate. Yeah. And I think there were a lot of people who advised me, you should be cautious, this is going to be successful, the president has a very high approval rating, and you could end up losing the election as a consequence of this.
Let me ask it this way. A lot of times candidates are accused of flip-flopping, but actually sometimes flip-flopping is smart because you actually have decided a better position based on knowledge that you didn't have. Right. What's the most significant position you held 10 years ago that you no longer hold today, that you've flipped on, you've changed on because you actually see it differently?
Because I actually changed my mind. You
changed your mind, exactly.
Well, you know, I'm trying to think back 10 years ago. I think that a good example would be the issue of welfare reform, where I always believed that welfare had to be changed. I was much more concerned 10 years ago when President Clinton initially signed the bill that this could have disastrous results. I worked in the Illinois legislature to make sure that we were providing child care and health care and other support services for the women who were going to be kicked off the rolls after a certain time. It worked better than I think a lot of people anticipated. And you know, one of the things that I am absolutely convinced of is that we have to have work as a centerpiece of any social policy. Okay. Not only because Not only because ultimately people who work are going to get more income, but the intrinsic dignity of work, the sense of purpose.
We were made for work.
We're made for work, and the sense that you're part of a community because you're making a contribution, no matter how small, to the well-being of the country as a whole. I think that is something that Democrats generally.
You know, by a strange coincidence, I was not elected Miss Congeniality again in the United States Senate this year. I don't know why. I don't know why. Climate change, out of control spending, torture, the list goes on a large number of issues that I've put my country first and I've reached across the aisle. But I'd probably have to say that one of the times that probably was one of the most trying was when I was first a member of Congress, and I'm a new freshman in the House of Representatives and very loyal and dedicated to President Reagan, who I still think is one of the great, great presidents in American history. Who won the Cold War without firing a shot, in the words of Margaret Thatcher. He wanted to send troops to Beirut for a peacekeeping mission. My knowledge and my background told me that a few hundred Marines in a situation like that could not successfully carry out any kind of peacekeeping mission, and I thought they were going into harm's way. Tragically, as many of you recall, there was a bombing of the Marine barracks, and well over 100 brave Marines gave their lives. But it was tough, that vote, because I went against the president I believed in the party that believed that maybe I was disloyal very early in my political career.
There's a verse in the Bible that says intelligent people look for ideas. In fact, they search for them. What's the most significant position that you've held 10 years ago that you no longer hold today? I think the point I'm trying to make is that leaders are not stubborn. They do change their mind with additional information. So give me a good example of something that was 10 years ago, you said, that's the way I feel about it, and now 10 years later, it's different. That's not flip-flopping, it's just sometimes growing in wisdom.
Offshore drilling, we got to drill now, and we got to drill here, and we got to become independent of foreign oil. I know that there's some here in California that disagree with that position. Could I also mention very seriously about this issue, my friends, you know that this is a national security issue. We're sending $700 billion a year to countries that don't like us very much, that some of that money is ending up in the hands of terrorist organizations. We cannot allow this greatest transfer of wealth in history and our national security to continue to be threatened. And Rick, I know we've got a lot of issues to cover, but let me just say, at the town hall meetings that I have every day, that's the issue on people's mind is energy. So I think if I could just take 30 seconds. One, we've got to do everything. We've got to do wind, tide, solar, natural gas, hydrogen cars, hybrid cars, electric cars, and we have to have nuclear power in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save on our energy costs. And by the way, in case you hadn't noticed it, the French, 80%, we love to imitate the French, 80% of their electricity is generated by nuclear power. If they can do it and reprocess, we can too, my friends. And by the way, if you hadn't noticed, we now have a pro-American president of France, which shows if you live long enough, anything can happen in America.
Can shift on.
What's the most significant, let me ask it this way, what's the most gut-wrenching decision you've ever had to make, and how did you process that to come to that decision?
Well, you know, I think the opposition to the war in Iraq was as tough a decision as I've had to make. Not only because there were political consequences, but also because Saddam Hussein was a real